Coming up, America's stagnant political and financial climates.
Why is it that the political system today seems so gridlocked? Why is the issue of brinkmanship in America so incredibly debilitating?
Financial Times commentator Gillian Tett explains how political problems in the U.S. have led to economic woes and stifled innovation. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
As a devoted reader of the Financial Times, I've been following Gillian's columns for some time and confess I am a fan. As one of the few people who astutely predicted the current fiscal crisis, Gillian's reporting continues to impress readers with a mixture of infinite intelligence, perceptiveness, and appropriate skepticism, all qualities that are necessary for keeping us not only informed but wiser than most, thus securing her reputation as one of the most influential journalists reporting today.
I'm speaking here this morning as a sort of insider-outsider. I have been living in America in recent years. I'm not American, as you can hear from my voice. I'm also someone who was trained as a social anthropologist to look at social systems and cultural systems, and yet in recent years I've been actually writing about economics and finance as a journalist. So I have a rather unusual insider-outsider perspective that I hope to bring to bear in talking about where I see America going today. And what I particularly want to talk about is the political economy and the dynamics of that political economy as they exist today in the 21st century. I was in Washington at a group called the Business Council, which is a bit like a sort of lobbying come self-help group for CEOs, where you have several dozen CEOs of large American or multinational companies. Interestingly enough, they're increasingly actually not American these days, who get together, talk about the issues of the day and try to lobby, but I think also engage in an awful lot of group therapy. They were having a lot of arguments about fiscal issues, about the administration's relationship with business, about the future of America and the competitiveness of America. But one of the most interesting things was that this group had done a survey of its members a few weeks before, asking the CEOs which group or which institution they thought had done the best job in terms of managing the crisis over the past year. Now, top of the list of different social actors that the CEOs thought had done a great job was, in fact, the CEOs. CEOs don't get paid to be modest. And 90% of CEOs thought that CEOs had done very well. Second to that, with 80% approval, were the central bankers. I'm not sure they'd be quite the same today, perhaps, but that was quite interesting. Right at the bottom, with a 5% approval rate, basically competing with the eurozone for negative marks, was Congress. And just above that was the presidency. Between that, you had things like the IMF, NGOs, etc., and the media. In third place, way, way ahead of Congress. Can any of you guess what was there?
The military?
Sadly not. The Chinese government. American CEOs, when they were asked who has done a good job of managing the financial crisis, managing the economic challenges, put the Chinese government way ahead of the American government, and never mind the eurozone. The UK government wasn't actually there as a separate category, but I don't think they would have been that high. To my mind, that's very, very interesting, because on the one hand, it speaks to a certain sense of perhaps naive admiration for the Chinese economy these days. But more importantly, it highlights a very profound sense of disenchantment with the way that the political processes are occurring in America today. In particular, I would argue it points to a deep malaise with a sense of gridlock, the sense of brinkmanship, the sense of sheer polarization and paralysis that grips so much of the political body. Now, America is certainly not alone in facing these challenges in this era of brinkmanship. I was made very clearly aware of this fundamental Western pattern of brinkmanship when I attended a meeting in Washington at the Atlantic Council, where I had a chance to listen to a man who's probably got about the worst possible sales job today in America. That man in question is someone called De Almeida, who is the European Union's ambassador to America. And his job is to go around America and try to persuade Americans that what's happening in the eurozone today makes sense. Even better, he tries to persuade them that not only does the eurozone make sense, but it's also a great place to invest. Luckily, he's charming. He's a very, very good salesman. He's got a wonderfully smooth, seductive Portuguese manner. And he actually tells a very good story. And roughly speaking, the story he tells, the story that Barroso, his boss, would say, is something like this. When you Americans look at the eurozone and see the ghastly mess that it appears to be, when you look at the headlines in the Financial Times saying crisis, when you get tempted to panic, don't. Because what's going on today in the eurozone, he would argue, is really part of a cosmetic dance, a piece of carefully staged theatre. The leaders of the eurozone know perfectly well that the fundamentals of the eurozone today just don't work. It's very hard to have monetary union without fiscal union and banking union. So there's a kind of recognition that the direction of travel is that you're going to have to deal with these contradictions. The problem, though, is that historically in Europe, because you've had a system of consensus amongst those 17 governments, there's really only two ways you can actually get agreement to move forward on big, tough issues. Either you all sit around and wait, i.e. have these long, interminable, ghastly, unbelievably boring committee meetings in Brussels, which I used to cover as a journalist, and they take hours and hours and hours, and nothing appears to happen. But if you have enough of them over a period of several months or years, gradually the consensus shifts slowly and action happens. Or if you don't have time to wait, you have to go for the alternative scenario, which is to have a crisis. And that will then shock everyone enough into action and you can move forward. And so if you're trying to look at Eurozone today through that prism, essentially what you can see is over the last 2 or 3 years, there has been a direction of travel. Essentially, the continent has started tiptoeing towards talking about fiscal union and actually implementing some aspects of banking union. But it only really does that by staging a crisis every 3 to 6 months. So what happens is you have drama, you have default, you have or threatened default, you have unions out on having a strike, you have all this kind of, tantrums. You have the Financial Times putting crisis on the headlines, which helps our sales wonderfully, and everyone waves their hands, and just when it seems that the whole system's about to go over the edge of the cliff, somebody, usually Mario Draghi, pulls it back, you move forward, and the game starts again. So essentially, if you believe that story, what the people around Barroso would argue is that Europe is moving forward, even within that crisis, but moving forward very much with a dynamic of brinkmanship, of cliff dancing. And essentially, there is a direction of travel. So that's a sales job from the European Union as far as America's concerned. I'm not sure how many Americans would actually believe it or buy it. I'm even less sure how many Americans would be reassured enough to want to go off and invest in Europe right now. But in many ways, it's a pretty, to my mind, convincing explanation about what's going on. But what's fascinating is that if you turn that pattern round and try to look at America today as a European, if you looked at America from the perspective of someone like De Almeida, in some ways, whether you like the idea of that brinkmanship pattern or not, that's kind of what America's been going through for the last couple of years as well. Not quite for the same reasons. I mean, America is not driven by any image of consensus building. On the contrary, the whole system is driven by checks and balances, and it's built into the American system that there is this assumption that there should be conflict, debate, and tensions. And yet, the outcome of that system built around checks and balances, the outcome of a system built on the idea that you needed to have competitive debate to get anywhere, has produced very much a pattern of brinkmanship, of cliff dancing, of constant tantrums, of constant drama, of constant cycle of going to the edge of a crisis, everyone waving their hands and wailing, the Financial Times having yet more wonderful headlines to sell newspapers with, and then just when it looks as if the system's going to go over the edge, you pull back and hopefully, you move forward. Why is it that the political system today seems so gridlocked? Why is the issue of brinkmanship in America so incredibly debilitating and so very real? Is this something which has always been the case in American history? Or is there something else going on today which is actually fueling this problem and making this age of brinkmanship quite so pernicious? And to my mind, there are several factors that people need to look at which are potentially feeding into this particular dynamic. One is the fact that the American population is increasingly split and polarized in its views. You can see that in a lot of the opinion polls that are taken in terms of where people identify themselves. You can see it in many, many other aspects of fragmentation that is underway in a social and economic sense, that's adding to that sense of political polarization. And that's fueling into a second problem, which is a lack of unifying vision. For so much of the past century, America has been unified by a sense that either it was trying to create a common vision for the country and people to rally around, or it was unified by the sense of fighting against a clear enemy, be that the Second World War, be it the Cold War years. Today, there is no single common enemy. Yes, there are many, many competitors, there are many challenges. There is no single one common enemy. And the dream of social mobility and the dream of opportunity and entrepreneurship that has held America together as a social glue for so many decades is increasingly coming under pressure precisely because of that economic polarization and fragmentation. And on top of that, I think there's another more subtle challenge, which is what I call the challenge of the economic pie. I worked in Japan in the late 1990s during that country's financial crisis, and while I was there watching the Japanese respond to their own banking crisis, I was very struck by the degree to which the Japanese appeared to be extraordinarily good at sharing out pain. And not just sharing out pain, but sharing out pain in a way that ensured that everyone in society continued to feel that they had a stake in the system carrying on. I remember very clearly going to talk to a senior Japanese banker who told me that he was going to have to cut his wage bill by 10%. And he said to me, well, that means, of course, I'm going to cut everyone's salary by 10% and my salary by 20%. And I went, of course. And he sort of looked at me and said, you're British. In Britain, I'm sure I would cut 10% of the workforce. And I went, oh. And he went, and in America, I would cut 30% and I'd pay myself 20% more. But if you look back at how the Japanese have responded to economic pressure, time and time again during the last 2 decades, they've managed to respond to the need to make sacrifices by ensuring that they're shared sacrifices. And Japanese society is riddled with cultural mechanisms and traditions, which I, as an anthropologist, would argue are all about trying to make sure that you not only share the gains, but you share the pain as well. Now, America is driven by a very different cultural vibe. It was founded by pioneers and pilgrims who arrived in America believing that the sky was the limit. If you ran out of land in the East, young man, you just went west. You could always grow the pie. There was always more. There was no resource constraint. You could always expand that pie through either conquest, acquisition, immigration, entrepreneurship, innovation. And during much of American history, that's been true. I mean, throughout most of American history, leaving aside the Depression years, that pie has kept growing. And even today, it's baked into the American psyche that the pie will just keep expanding. I mean, it would almost be taboo for any politician to stand up today in Washington and say, resources are constrained. We're going to have to start talking about how to divide up a pie that may not be shrinking, but probably is actually going to be pretty static. Essentially, people are constantly talking past the issues. And one of the reasons why you end up with this constant sense of gridlock or brinkmanship is precisely because if no one wants to talk honestly about these issues, you don't really have much left except for tantrums or all kinds of complex games. And then, of course, Although in theory, if you had some external shocks to rally around or to provoke people into action, that could help push the dynamic forward. In reality, one of the tragedies right now is that there is so little sense of external pressure to break the gridlock. I mean, back in those of you who are old enough to remember the Sputnik era, will remember how the sudden shock of seeing that the Soviet Union had put up the Sputnik up into space really acted as a galvanizing force to get many parts of American society to pull together and start pushing forward with investment in science and technology and a commitment to building the industrial machine. Similarly, if you think back to 2008, and remember in the aftermath of the Lehman Brothers shock, how the collapse of the markets was a trigger that actually sparked Congress into improving the TARP deal, you can see how a sudden market shock can actually have that kind of impact on the psyche and help to break the gridlock. The problem today, though, is that the Chinese competitive pressures and threats, the type of challenges you're seeing from elsewhere in the world, are not of the Sputnik variety. They're kind of slow burn, insidious challenges that almost creep up on the American body politic. It reminds me of the wonderful Japanese phrase that if you put a frog into a pan of boiling water, it jumps out. If you put a frog into a pan of cold water and heat it up slowly, it kind of just sits there and dies. And much of the Chinese competitive threat is in that second camp. Now, if you want to be cheerful about all this, I don't mean to start sounding like I'm going to leave you going out feeling really gloomy. If you want to be cheerful, there's two things you can point to. One of which is that, well, even though we have this culture of insidious brinkmanship, this problem of trying to find a way for the American system to talk about dividing up a pie when no one really wants to talk about that, at least the economy is not falling off a cliff, or not yet. And secondly, if you want to be cheerful, you can also argue that the great thing about the market psychology of the past 5 years is that investors have kind of become used to crisis. If you think back to where we were 10 years ago in the era of great moderation, and imagine how you might have reacted if you'd picked up a newspaper which said, Greece about to leave the eurozone, or America flirting on the edge of default. You know, you might have actually panicked, been shocked, been surprised. These days, courtesy of the fact that we've had these headlines coming out every 3 months as part of this game of cliff dancing, markets have become almost blasé about extraordinary things. It's a bit like that Alice in Wonderland tag that, I've learnt to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. I mean, post the Lehman Brothers period, we've all learnt to kind of accept the fact that the sky is falling in fairly regularly, but hey, we can kind of cope. So that's the good news. The bad news is history suggests that markets have a nasty habit of not reacting to anything for a very long time and then suddenly panicking. And panic has a nasty habit of being contagious and hard to stop when it finally breaks. Second reason to be concerned about this era of brinkmanship is the fact that it's certainly not helping to restore business investment or confidence. You may have seen that the recent fall-off in business investment was one of the key factors dragging down the overall GDP rate recently is not very encouraging. And I'm in absolutely no doubt that one of the key reasons why businesses are so nervous about investing is not just because they're uncertain about where the economy is going in terms of final demand. There's also profound uncertainty about the political equation. Then, of course, we have the problems of consumers and the increasing lack of trust amongst consumers in not just the direction of politics, but the very institutions of politics that shape our country or shape America. There's a lot of very interesting survey data that has come out recently looking at consumer attitudes towards trust, what they do or don't trust in. And very briefly, what this shows is that not only has there been a real erosion of trust in banks and companies in the last 5 years, there's also been a real erosion in trust in government. And in fact, that's gone hand in hand with a shift away from what people might call vertical axes of trust, where people look up to authority figures like CEOs and politicians for advice and leadership, to a world where people increasingly look to a group known as people like me, i.e. your Facebook friends. There's increasingly a shift from the vertical axis to a horizontal axis. But lastly, and this really is the last point, and I will go to questions, this era of brinkmanship threatens to cause real damage for the degree of credibility and standing that America, and in fact much of the West, has across the world in general. I spent much of the last few years going to all manner of international meetings like G7, Davos, etc. And what strikes me very forcibly since 2007, the sense of self-confidence that used to wrap the G7 leaders, particularly the American leaders, at these international gatherings, has really started to evaporate. And you can see that we've gone from a world where there was a real pole around which the rest of the globe was congregating, or at least circulating, to a world where it's much more evenly split and balanced. The fact that American CEOs are saying they think the Chinese leadership is one of the most effective bodies in managing the crisis, it does not necessarily mean that China is about to leap out of the woodwork and become the new pole of the global economy. I mean, for one thing, I think if you were to ask Chinese business leaders to evaluate their own Chinese government, they probably, ironically, would give much, much lower marks than the Americans. And thus far, at least, although China has been rising in financial power and increasingly looking to expand its political footprint, in no way does a country like China represent an alternative pole around which the global system can orbit. And the longer that Washington, the longer that we see the eurozone leadership locked in this brinkmanship pattern, locked in this pattern of gridlock, seemingly unable to act in any decisive way to tackle the really big problems, the more the sense of erosion of moral authority is gathering pace, and the more we're being moved towards a more unstable era where essentially power is eddying around without a clear pole. So, I don't mean to provide an entirely gloomy picture. I do think that the good news, as I say, is that the underlying dynamics of the economy are still creating reasonable growth within the US. But the challenges are very, very significant. I hope I'm wrong. I have a nasty feeling I'm not. But in the meantime, I just wish you all the best of luck in trying to find a way through it. Thank you.
There was one thing that I didn't hear in your talk that perhaps can unlock the key to expanding the pie, as you call it, and that is a successful integration of the United States into the global economy. Problem is that it's easier to mobilize people out of fear than opportunity, and therein lies the challenge for the political leadership.
Absolutely. I mean, I often think that the single best thing that would happen right now for the American political system would be to have a bond market crash and to have the Chinese launch their own iPad. And if those things happened at once, you know, you had a Chinese leading the way with the iPad. In fact, something even sexier than an iPad, you know, maybe sort of, mobile television coming out of China. That would really shock the ordinary consumers into saying, help. And if the bond market's crashed, I mean, I sometimes like to joke that what America needs right now is a Goldilocks bond market crash, in the sense of, people used to talk about Goldilocks inflation, not too hot, not too cold, just a bit of inflation, but without making the whole system go haywire. You kind of need a Goldilocks bond market crash, i.e. not too bad that it's going to tip the whole financial system into a tailspin, but just big enough to shock people. Unfortunately, haven't had that.
The real issue that politicians don't want to talk about anywhere is that you've really got to decide how the government spends its revenues. How do we do this so the government spends money on infrastructure and education and less on entitlements?
Well, I think the way you do it personally is you recognise up front that there is no single magic wand. There is no one big thing that can solve the problem, which as a journalist is very frustrating to admit, because we want everything to be boiled down into a single headline and a 400-word article that goes, here is the answer, boom. In reality, what you need are trade-offs, and you need a combination of measures. And there was a very good piece in Bloomberg, actually, just to show that I do read things other than the FT. Actually, it's not impossible to fix a problem if you unveiled 10 different steps all at once. And they include things like getting more revenues from the wealthy, getting a bit more revenues from the middle class, cutting entitlement spending a bit, not crazily, but a bit, and above all, raising the retirement age and raising the age at which people can actually go on to medical help and things. I happen to think the retirement age issue is critical personally, because it's very clear that longevity is increasing. It's not increasing amongst the vulnerable groups or the poorer groups of society as much as amongst the wealthy, but it is increasing. And to my mind, it's very clear that you should be raising the pension age quite sharply. And it would probably be one of the fairest ways to do that. Unfortunately, though, it's been very hard to have that debate in Congress and to talk about that openly or frankly, because it comes back to this point about the fact that Americans don't want to talk about how to allocate pain. And you have a real sense of intergenerational fight and tension going on, which for the most part is concealed. One part of the world where they have agreed to raise the age quite significantly is in Japan, because there has been a recognition there that actually the elder generation has done quite nicely, and they should be paying a bit more to help society more broadly. But the day that I see someone in Congress stand up and say, actually, we should be raising the retirement age and the age at which you can claim benefits to 67, 68, 69, or even talking about a staggered raising of the age over a sort of 10-year, 20-year horizon, that would be the day that I really start to feel quite optimistic about the fiscal outlook.
Jillian, the new headline for the FT this morning should be, Jillian taxes us to think about the issues that matter. So with that, I want to thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.